When a narcissist finally accepts that you are gone for good, something profound begins to happen inside them. Before moving any further, it is worth pausing on the word forever, because it carries far more weight than most people realize. In discussions about narcissistic relationships and separation, this single word is often overlooked, despite being one of the most important parts of the entire experience. Forever is not simply about the passage of time. It is not measured by weeks, months, or even years. Instead, it represents a completely different kind of realization. There is an enormous psychological difference between a narcissist believing that you are temporarily absent and recognizing that you have truly left for good. That difference has very little to do with the amount of time that has passed. It is about the quiet moment when their internal world is finally forced to acknowledge reality. It is the point where they begin to understand the distinction between someone leaving as a temporary strategy and someone leaving with no intention of ever returning. It is the difference between silence meant to communicate a message and silence that marks the closing of a door that will never open again. During the first stages of no contact, through the opening weeks, and often even the first several months, most narcissists do not interpret your absence as a permanent loss. They simply do not experience it that way at first. Their minds are not wired to immediately conclude that someone has disappeared forever. Instead, their psychological defenses categorize your silence as something unfinished. In their mind, the situation remains unresolved rather than complete. They convince themselves that your absence is still something they can influence using the same methods that have worked for them throughout their lives. Because they rely on your attention to reinforce their sense of self, they struggle to imagine a reality where you are permanently beyond their reach. As a result, they see your silence as temporary instead of final. They mentally file it as an ongoing process rather than a completed ending. To them, everything still appears flexible enough to change with the right move. They believe that if they choose the correct strategy at the right time, they can reduce the distance between you just as they have done before. Because they continue operating from this assumption, they often display very predictable behaviors during the early stages of no contact. This is the period when they quietly monitor your activities, searching for updates through any avenue available. They may attempt indirect communication, dropping subtle messages or using mutual acquaintances to gauge your reaction. In some situations, they quickly enter a new relationship and make sure everyone sees it. The relationship is often displayed publicly with the hope that it reaches you. The purpose is not always genuine happiness. More often, it is designed to send a message. They want you to believe that you were easily replaced, hoping to stir feelings of jealousy, regret, or insecurity. As more time passes, these indirect efforts frequently become more obvious. They may eventually reach out directly in increasingly noticeable ways. Every one of these actions, from secretly watching your life to publicly showcasing a new relationship, reflects the mindset of someone who has not yet accepted the reality of forever. They continue behaving as though the story has not reached its conclusion and that another chapter is still waiting to be written. Eventually, however, something begins to change. Circumstances shift, and a quiet realization slowly starts taking shape. Inside the narcissist's world, undeniable evidence gradually accumulates until it reaches a point that can no longer be dismissed or explained away. This is when the true weight of forever finally settles in. What actually unfolds within the narcissist's mind during this realization is far different from what many people imagine. It is also much more psychologically complex than the simplified explanations that are commonly repeated. Before examining their reaction, it is important to understand what has to occur before this realization can genuinely take hold. This awareness does not happen automatically. It does not appear simply because another month has passed on the calendar. Time alone is rarely enough to convince a narcissist that your absence is permanent. Many of them can spend months or even years without contact while still refusing to accept that the relationship has truly ended. As long as certain conditions remain in place, they continue framing your absence as a temporary situation that has simply not resolved itself yet. The realization of forever only arrives after enough undeniable evidence has accumulated to overwhelm their psychological defenses. Eventually, the comforting belief that everything is temporary becomes impossible to maintain. Their protective mental framework begins to fail because reality grows too difficult to ignore. There are several different forms of evidence that consistently build toward this turning point. Together, they create increasing psychological pressure until a permanent shift becomes unavoidable. The first, and perhaps most important category, involves the gradual disappearance of indirect signs that you are still connected to their world. Even when someone practices strict no contact, they often remain visible in small ways. Shared friends, family members, and mutual acquaintances may unintentionally keep their presence alive. Social media can also leave traces behind. Even after blocking someone, small digital footprints often remain through overlapping networks, shared communities, or mutual connections. Because both people continue living within similar social environments, the narcissist often receives occasional pieces of information about your life. They may hear gossip from someone you both know, come across a photograph through another person, or learn about an important life event without ever speaking to you directly. Although you have done nothing to encourage this, these tiny pieces of information become psychologically significant to them. Their mind treats every indirect update as evidence that the situation is still active. In their perception, these small signals prove that you remain part of the same world they occupy. They reassure themselves that you are still accessible under the right circumstances. They convince themselves that sooner or later they will discover the right opportunity or the right person to reconnect with you. But eventually, even those indirect traces begin to disappear. The mutual connections gradually stop sharing updates. The friends you once had in common are no longer mutual as clear boundaries are established and respected. When the narcissist reaches out, searching for an indirect sign and hoping to gather even the smallest piece of information about you, they discover nothing except a deep and overwhelming silence. They no longer encounter a carefully maintained distance that they believe can eventually be crossed. Instead, they are confronted with a true and complete absence. When this begins to happen, the illusion that everything is only temporary starts losing one of its strongest foundations. The loss of that support does not instantly shatter their psychological structure, but it weakens it in significant ways. Their confidence begins to wobble. It introduces an unsettling sense of uncertainty into a place that was previously filled with comfortable denial. And for a personality built entirely around maintaining total control, uncertainty becomes an intensely painful and deeply uncomfortable experience. It creates a form of emotional distress that demands immediate resolution, forcing them to examine more closely what is truly unfolding. The second category of evidence that slowly accumulates and eventually forces the reality of permanence to settle in is the complete failure of every attempt they make to reconnect. We are not referring to the failure of a single text message or one unanswered phone call. One failed attempt is incredibly easy for the narcissist's mind to dismiss. They can effortlessly fit a single rejection into the reassuring belief that this is merely a temporary obstacle. They convince themselves that they simply chose the wrong method or that they only need to wait for a more favorable moment before trying again. Instead, we are talking about the repeated and consistent failure of numerous attempts made through many different avenues. These efforts happen across different platforms using different emotional approaches while relying on different psychological strategies. They may try expressing anger, they may attempt sincere apologies, they may pretend that nothing ever happened, they may even target the exact emotional vulnerabilities that years of knowing you revealed to them. Yet every one of those efforts produces the exact same outcome: complete and uninterrupted silence. Every failed attempt becomes another undeniable piece of evidence. Every moment of silence that greets their reaching hand communicates the true distance between their present reality and the possibility of returning to the relationship they once controlled. Gradually, this information begins to accumulate. The evidence continues stacking until the repeated pattern of failure becomes so overwhelming that it can no longer be explained away. They are no longer able to blame poor timing, an awkwardly written message, or some small misunderstanding. Eventually, the only explanation left for this continuous wall of silence is that every attempt is arriving in a place where a permanent decision has already been made. They are forced to recognize that the door they keep desperately reaching toward is not simply closed for the moment. It has completely ceased to exist in the way they expected it to. This becomes the point where the reality of forever starts moving steadily toward them. It has not fully settled yet, but it is drawing very near. Deep within their psychological system, they begin to notice that the silence has changed. They recognize that this is no longer the intentional silence of someone attempting to make a statement. Instead, it is the calm, unreachable distance that comes from a final conclusion which cannot be reversed. The third category of evidence, and the one that most often delivers the final impact, forcing the reality of forever to settle completely, is learning about your personal growth through whatever channels remain available. This information communicates, either directly or indirectly, that you are no longer the same individual who walked away from the relationship. It reveals that the version of you they are trying to reconnect with no longer exists in the form they once knew or controlled. They slowly realize that the emotional blueprint they once carried of you, the catalog of insecurities they relied upon, the emotional needs they previously exploited, and the specific manipulation techniques they perfected have all become completely useless. They are attempting to play yesterday's game with someone who has already grown beyond its rules. You have changed. You have traveled much farther than simply placing physical distance between yourself and the relationship. You are creating a different life. You are discovering genuine happiness, rebuilding your confidence, or quietly living with a peaceful strength that reflects true emotional healing. Even from far away, this quiet presence communicates something unmistakable. It tells them that the entrance they hoped to reopen was never merely locked. It has been entirely removed. In its place stands something completely different, something that belongs only to you, something created for your future rather than your past. Most importantly, it no longer has a handle on the side where the narcissist is standing. When this realization finally reaches the narcissist, it does not arrive softly or gradually. It crashes into their psychological system like an unexpected shockwave. It becomes the final, undeniable piece of evidence that pushes them beyond the point of denial, allowing the heavy reality of forever to fully settle. What unfolds inside their mind during that exact moment is something that rarely occurs within their normal psychological experience. It is a situation their defensive system was never built to endure. The reaction remains deeply concealed because everything that truly matters within the narcissist's internal world exists far beneath the carefully managed surface they present to others. Yet, despite remaining hidden, the experience is incredibly powerful. It is also far more layered and complicated than the simple stories people often tell themselves about what this moment must feel like. Rather than experiencing one straightforward emotion, the narcissist undergoes a profound psychological collapse that surprises even them. And that unexpected internal reaction is exactly what deserves closer examination. The hidden response we are describing is not a single emotion arriving neatly before leading to one predictable behavior. Instead, it resembles a massive internal collision where several overwhelming psychological experiences strike all at once. Multiple emotional realities arrive simultaneously, placing enormous pressure on a psychological structure that was never designed to contain them together. Because their internal system cannot successfully process all of these experiences at the same time, it produces an intense state of psychological confusion. For someone whose entire personality depends upon carefully regulating and controlling every internal emotional state, this level of inner disorder becomes one of the most destabilizing experiences they have ever encountered. The first major element of this internal collision is the sudden and unmistakable experience of irreversibility. For the narcissist, irreversibility has never been something they have comfortably accepted as part of life. Their entire relationship history has been defined by an extraordinary sense of reversibility. They have repeatedly believed that almost every relationship could eventually be reopened, repaired, reclaimed, or manipulated back into existence whenever they decided the timing was right. This belief became one of the invisible foundations supporting their entire worldview. They assumed that people remained emotionally available somewhere in the background, even after months or years had passed. They believed that with the right words, enough persistence, or the proper emotional pressure, they could eventually regain access whenever they wanted. That assumption allowed them to avoid confronting genuine endings because permanent loss never truly felt real inside their psychological landscape. But when forever finally becomes undeniable, that deeply rooted belief begins collapsing. Suddenly, they are confronted with something they cannot negotiate, charm, manipulate, intimidate, or emotionally influence. They recognize that time has continued moving forward without them, and that your life has continued developing in directions that no longer include their presence. That realization carries enormous psychological weight because it represents something entirely unfamiliar. It introduces the terrifying possibility that there are consequences they cannot erase and opportunities they can never recover. For someone whose identity has always depended upon maintaining the illusion of control, this realization creates an emotional crisis unlike anything they have previously experienced. It forces them into direct contact with a reality they spent years avoiding. They begin recognizing that certain chapters truly do close forever, and that not every ending can be rewritten according to their desires. This awareness produces an internal pressure that continues growing with every passing day. They revisit old memories, replay previous conversations, reconsider choices they once defended without hesitation, and quietly wonder whether a different decision might have produced an entirely different future. Although they rarely admit these thoughts openly, they begin occupying increasing amounts of space inside their mind. The deeper this awareness settles, the more difficult it becomes to preserve the grand narrative they previously believed about themselves. The certainty they once carried begins giving way to hesitation. The confidence that once appeared effortless becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Even if they continue presenting an image of complete indifference to the outside world, something fundamental has already shifted beneath the surface. What makes this experience especially painful is that it cannot be solved through their usual strategies. They cannot manufacture another version of you who will respond exactly as you once did. They cannot recreate the emotional environment that previously allowed them to maintain control. They cannot simply erase your growth or convince themselves that none of it happened. Reality continues existing, whether they acknowledge it or not, and each passing day quietly confirms the permanence of everything they hoped was only temporary. That is why the realization of forever becomes so psychologically overwhelming. It is not simply about losing one person, it is about losing an entire system of certainty that supported the way they understood relationships, power, and themselves. Once that foundation begins breaking apart, every assumption built upon it becomes unstable as well. The collapse is rarely visible to outsiders, but internally, it continues unfolding in slow, painful waves that challenge the very structure of the narcissist's carefully protected psychological world. They have always believed they could reverse endings, return to relationships that were considered finished, and use the perfect method at the perfect time to unlock doors that appeared permanently closed. Throughout their entire life, their experiences have repeatedly shown them that almost nothing in their relationships is truly final. They developed the belief that if they discovered the right approach and executed it carefully enough, they could always repair what was broken. They always assumed there was a way back, but you became the rare exception that challenged that entire history. The moment the reality of forever finally reaches their awareness is the exact moment this exception becomes impossible for them to ignore. They begin to understand that you represent something completely beyond the reach of the strategies and techniques they have always depended on. For someone whose entire sense of power and control is based on the belief that the right move can always create the outcome they desire, facing something truly irreversible is more than simple disappointment. It becomes a deep psychological disturbance. It shakes the very foundation of how they understand relationships, human behavior, and their own ability to influence others. When a belief that has supported their entire worldview begins to collapse, the result is not merely sadness or frustration. It creates a powerful internal conflict that feels almost impossible for them to process. The second part of this internal collision appears at the same time as the realization that something cannot be undone, and it is something even more uncomfortable and unfamiliar for them. It is an emotion their narcissistic system does not have the proper language to describe. In reality, recognizing this feeling would require a level of self-awareness that their psychological defenses have spent years preventing. But when their behavior is observed from the outside, the closest description of this feeling is genuine loss. This is not the ordinary loss of attention or validation they experience after previous relationships end. It is not simply a temporary emptiness in their emotional environment that can be quickly filled by finding someone new. This is something much deeper and much older. It exists within the most hidden and protected part of their mind, the authentic self that their complex defense mechanisms were created to shield. This is the part of them that your connection reached during those rare moments when their walls lowered and their defenses became weaker. It is the part of them that experienced what it felt like to be truly understood, recognized and accepted by another person. Now, the reality of forever means that this connection is disappearing permanently, with no opportunity to negotiate, return, or ask for another chance. At the exact moment this truth settles in, that hidden part of them experiences something resembling genuine grief. However, they do not experience this grief in a healthy or complete way. They cannot process it like someone who has full emotional awareness, where pain is acknowledged, experienced, and eventually integrated into their personal growth. Instead, their grief appears in scattered pieces. It appears during the quiet moments between their attempts to seek new attention and distraction. It emerges when they are no longer moving fast enough to escape the uncomfortable silence inside themselves. They may suddenly feel it on an ordinary evening on a day that should feel completely normal, yet something feels unusually heavy. There is a strange emptiness they cannot fully explain. They struggle to connect this feeling to its true origin because doing so would require them to look toward a place their defenses have worked hard to keep hidden for years. But even though the grief is buried, incomplete, and difficult for them to understand, it is still present. Its emotional weight can become far greater than anything their previous experiences prepared them to face. The third part of this collision is the element that creates the most noticeable changes in their behavior, and it is often the most unexpected thing for others to observe. From the outside, it may appear as intense anger, but it is not the same type of anger that appeared during the relationship. It is not the controlled, strategic, and intentional anger they use to manipulate situations, gain control, or influence your reactions. This is a completely different form of anger. This anger is more unstable. It is more chaotic. It is less calculated and much harder for them to manage. What makes it especially interesting is that this anger is not truly directed toward you. Instead, it turns inward and becomes focused on their own psychological system. They become frustrated with their own misjudgment. They become angry that their understanding of you was inaccurate, that the methods they trusted failed, and that the confidence they had in their ability to maintain control over you was completely mistaken.